They wrapped the newborn in cloth and dug a second hole, just in case. In the Middle Ages, this wasn't unusual. It was expected. But why? What made half of all babies vanish before their lives even began? The answers aren't just grim. They're unsettling in ways no one talks about. To understand, you have to start at the very beginning. Medieval childbirth was a dangerous gamble where the odds were stacked against everyone involved. Most babies entered the world in cramped home spaces lit only by candles or firelight. The most qualified person present was usually a local midwife who had learned her trade through experience rather than formal training. Midwives worked with knives from the kitchen, scissors used for cutting cloth, and rags that had seen better days. The idea of cleaning these tools between uses was completely foreign. If germs had frequent flyer miles, medieval birthing rooms would have been their favorite vacation spots. Infections spread easily when the same unwashed instruments were used on multiple mothers during difficult deliveries. When complications arose during birth, there were no emergency procedures to save mother or child. Babies who came out feet first instead of head first faced terrible odds. The umbilical cord could wrap around a baby's neck, cutting off oxygen with no way to quickly fix the problem. Medieval delivery complications were solved with about as much medical precision as throwing darts blindfolded. Premature babies had virtually no chance of survival. Without incubators, breathing assistance, or specialized medical care, these tiny infants were simply wrapped in cloth and placed near the fire for warmth. A premature baby's survival plan was basically to get tough or get going, and most chose the latter option. The statistics were brutal. In many regions, 30 to 50% of babies died before reaching their first birthday. This meant that out of every 10 babies born, only 5 or 6 would live to see their first winter. The first week of life was especially deadly, with many infants dying within days of birth from complications that today's doctors could easily prevent or treat. But even if a baby managed to survive those first terrifying moments of life, their troubles were far from over. The next challenge waiting for them was just as deadly and much more persistent. Once a baby somehow made it through the birth process alive, the next challenge was figuring out how to stay fed without dying from the food itself. This might sound straightforward, but in medieval times, infant feeding was fraught with dangers that parents couldn't even see coming. Breast milk was the best option when available, but life often had other plans. Mothers who died during childbirth obviously couldn't nurse their babies. Others became too sick to produce milk, or simply couldn't make enough to keep their infants fed. Finding a reliable milk source was like trying to squeeze water from a stone, except sometimes the stone was your only option. Wealthy families could hire wet nurses, women who had recently given birth and could nurse another family's baby along with their own. Finding a good wet nurse was harder than finding a needle in a haystack, especially when the haystack was full of women who might accidentally poison your baby. Not every wet nurse was healthy, reliable, or even available when needed. When wet nurses weren't an option, families turned to animal milk as a substitute. Cow's milk, goat milk, and various animal broths became the backup plan. The problem was that these alternatives were often contaminated with bacteria and weren't designed for human infant digestion. Families also prepared something called pap, which was essentially bread soaked in milk or water until it turned into mush. This mixture filled babies' stomachs but provided little of the nutrition that growing infants actually needed. Feeding pap to a baby was roughly equivalent to fueling a race car with maple syrup. It might run for a while, but it wasn't going to win any races. The containers used for feeding were breeding grounds for dangerous bacteria. Families had no understanding of sterilization, so feeding cloths and bowls were rarely cleaned properly. Without refrigeration, milk spoils quickly in warm weather. While parents struggled with these feeding problems, another challenge emerged that would test families in unexpected ways, forcing them to make decisions that balanced love with harsh reality. The relationship between medieval families and their newborn babies was complicated by the harsh reality of infant mortality. Parents developed coping strategies that might seem strange or heartless today, but made perfect sense in a world where babies died with alarming frequency. Many families intentionally delayed baptizing their newborn children for days or even weeks after birth. This wasn't because they forgot or didn't care about their baby's spiritual welfare, but because they wanted to see if the child would survive long enough to make the ceremony worthwhile. Rushing to baptize a baby who might die the next day was like buying concert tickets for someone who might not show up to the show. The naming process followed similar logic. While modern parents might spend months debating between different names, medieval families often waited to see if their baby would live long enough to actually need a name. Many newborns were simply called baby, or the little one, until their parents felt confident about their survival chances. Naming a newborn immediately was like calling dibs on a chair that might collapse before you could sit down. This practical approach created a serious spiritual dilemma for Christian families. According to church teachings, babies who died without baptism couldn't enter heaven. Parents found themselves caught between protecting their own hearts from potential grief and potentially condemning their children's souls. Church records from this period reflect the grim reality of infant mortality. Many entries for dead babies list them simply as child or infant without personal names. These anonymous entries represent thousands of tiny lives that ended before they had a chance to develop individual identities. The emotional distance that families maintained wasn't cruelty, but rather psychological survival. Falling in love with every baby was like adopting every stray animal that wandered into your yard. Noble in theory, but devastating in practice. Yet while families wrestled with these spiritual and emotional dilemmas, the physical world around their babies was creating its own set of deadly problems that most parents couldn't even see. Medieval homes were essentially death traps designed by people who had no idea they were creating obstacle courses for babies. The living conditions that families considered normal would horrify modern parents, but medieval people had no way of knowing that their everyday environment was slowly killing their children. Clean water was about as rare as unicorns in most medieval communities. Families collected water from rivers, wells, and springs that were regularly contaminated with human waste, dead animals, and industrial runoff from upstream sources. The local water supply had more unwanted guests than a house party that got out of control. Waste disposal was handled with all the sophistication of throwing garbage out the window and hoping it would disappear. Most homes had no indoor plumbing or organized sewage systems. Human waste was dumped in streets, tossed from upper-story windows, or collected in pits that were dug dangerously close to homes and water sources. Medieval waste management followed the ancient philosophy of out of sight, out of mind, except it was never really out of sight. The floors inside medieval homes were typically made of packed dirt covered with rushes, straw, or other plant materials. While this might sound rustic and natural, these floor coverings absorb spills, food scraps, urine, and other bodily fluids, creating a permanent breeding ground for bacteria and parasites. Walking across a medieval floor was like tiptoeing through a science experiment that had been left to grow for months. Rats, mice, lice, and fleas weren't occasional visitors, but permanent household residents. These creatures left droppings everywhere, carried diseases, and multiplied faster than rabbits in springtime. Babies who learned to crawl were essentially exploring a contaminated playground where every surface was covered with animal waste and harmful bacteria. Flies served as tiny disease delivery services, traveling from outdoor latrines to indoor kitchens and sleeping areas. Unfortunately, these contaminated environments created perfect conditions for something even more terrifying than dirty floors and bad water. Invisible killers that struck without warning and spread faster than wildfire. Medieval babies faced an army of diseases that attacked with the efficiency of a military invasion and the mercy of a hungry lion. Without vaccines, antibiotics, or even basic knowledge about how diseases spread, infections swept through communities like wildfire, targeting the youngest and most vulnerable first. Measles was among the most feared childhood killers, spreading through communities with terrifying speed. This highly contagious disease caused high fevers, distinctive rashes, and often led to deadly complications like pneumonia or brain inflammation. Measles moved through medieval villages faster than gossip spreads through a church congregation, except instead of hurt feelings, it left behind rows of tiny graves. Smallpox was another merciless killer that showed no preference for age or social status. This viral disease covered victims with painful, pus-filled blisters and killed about 3 out of every 10 people it infected. Babies who managed to survive smallpox were left with permanent scars covering their bodies. Surviving smallpox was like winning a lottery where the prize was staying alive and the consolation gift was a face full of permanent reminders. Whooping cough earned its name from the distinctive sound that sick children made while struggling to breathe during violent coughing fits. For babies, these episodes could be fatal because their tiny airways would become completely blocked. Trying to breathe with whooping cough was like attempting to suck air through a straw while someone was strangling you. Pneumonia and bronchitis were frequently fatal because families had no way to fight bacterial infections in the lungs. What modern doctors can cure with simple antibiotics became death sentences for medieval infants. The Black Death deserves special mention for its sheer destructive power during the 14th century. This plague pandemic killed an estimated one-third of Europe's entire population within just a few years. Whole families, including babies and children, would die within days of showing the first symptoms. Even minor injuries could become deadly in a world without proper wound care. A small cut from a rusty tool might lead to tetanus, while a simple scrape could develop into life-threatening blood poisoning. Medieval babies faced one final enemy that might have been the cruelest of all: the very limitations of the world they were born into. The final blow to medieval infant survival came not from disease or poor living conditions alone, but from the crushing realities of daily life that made proper childcare nearly impossible. Medieval parents weren't heartless monsters who didn't love their children, but they lived in a world where basic survival required making choices that would seem unthinkable today. Most medieval families were trapped in endless cycles of backbreaking labor just to scrape together enough food and shelter to survive another day. Parents worked from sunrise to sunset in fields, workshops, or markets, leaving little time or energy for careful infant supervision. Childcare wasn't something you could delegate to a professional babysitter when your most qualified caregiver was probably a 12-year-old sibling who was also responsible for feeding livestock and hauling water. Swaddling was a widespread practice that sometimes caused more harm than good. Parents wrapped babies tightly in cloth strips, believing this would help their limbs grow straight and prevent them from scratching themselves with their fingernails. However, some families swaddled so tightly that babies couldn't breathe properly or suffered from restricted blood circulation. Swaddling a baby was supposed to keep them safe, but sometimes it worked about as well as wrapping a gift so tightly that you crushed what was inside. The harsh mathematics of medieval family economics forced parents to make heartbreaking decisions about where to focus their limited resources. Families with many children often concentrated their attention and food on older kids who had already proven they could survive. It was like being forced to choose which plants to water during a drought when you only had enough water for half your garden. High birth rates meant that many families had more children than they could realistically feed or care for properly. In a world without reliable birth control methods, babies arrived whether families were prepared or not. Overcrowded living conditions made individual attention nearly impossible for most families. Multiple generations often shared single rooms, with grandparents, parents, children, and sometimes servants all sleeping and living in the same cramped space. The emotional toll of losing child after child created communities where infant death became normalized to a shocking degree. Parents learned to limit their emotional investment in newborns because the psychological pain of repeated loss was simply unbearable. These social and economic pressures completed a perfect storm of factors that made medieval infancy one of the most dangerous periods in human history, explaining why so many tiny lives ended before they had a real chance to begin. When all these challenges combined together, medieval babies faced odds that would make modern parents weep. Surviving to see your first birthday was a remarkable achievement,